2NURFM.com, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
And joining us this morning is Dr. Jim Joes, Associate Professor in Politics at the University of Newcastle, to discuss politics. It is NAIDOC week, and we've seen this week a meeting between the Prime Minister, the Opposition Leader and Indigenous leaders to talk about recognising our first Australians in the Constitution. Jim, where are we at with this? Currently, what does the Constitution do?
Well, good morning, Meryl. The constitutional situation is that Indigenous Australians, like all Australians, are recognised as citizens, but that's one of the sort of generalities, shall we say. And after the 1967 referendum, which gave the Commonwealth power to legislate for any particular race, in effect that was a momentous sort of shift, because the second part of that referendum recognised Indigenous people as they could be counted in the census, whereas up until that time they were ignored, treated as part of the fauna of the country. So that was a momentous change, but going along with that, empowering the Commonwealth to legislate on particularly on behalf of Indigenous people, meant it took the power away from the states, because up until that time the states had overseen whatever happened to Indigenous peoples within their boundaries, and that was a consequence of federation. So the 1967 referendum really shifted, if you like, responsibility. And what's happening now is that the movement has slowly grown over sort of reconciliation processes, perhaps following on from the symbolic nature of the apology when Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister, that recognising Indigenous people as being the first Australians, as being here prior to white settlement, the colonial period and so forth. So recognising Indigenous people in the Constitution in a different way. And there are a couple of amendments that could be made as well. For example, the states still have some rights over legislating over race, and that's a particular, I think that's section 25 of the Constitution. That's something that could be repealed as part of the recognition process. Section 51 is the section where the Commonwealth has the power to legislate on behalf of any race, and the issue there is not so much that they shouldn't have the power as the national government to legislate if needed for particular measures to benefit or support Indigenous people. The constitutional situation at present is it can go in any direction. It doesn't have to be to the betterment of Indigenous people. It can be for any race, and it can be used negatively should a government decide that that's what it wishes to do. So a constitutional reform of sections 51 to clarify the intention, if you like, I think the intention of what people thought they were voting for back in 1967, which was to allow the Commonwealth government to enact measures that would advantage and enhance to the betterment of Australia's Indigenous citizens and its first people, so to speak.
So obviously wording will have to be agreed upon, both from a legal standpoint and also from all parties drafting the wording. But talk to me about what we would actually need in terms of a referendum by way of numbers.
Well, the technical process is relatively straightforward, although seemingly complex, because clearly the people who created the Constitution didn't want a mechanism that would be too easy to change the Constitution, but one which would allow change should the groundswell of support build up. So basically, any referendum proposal has to get a majority of the total population.
Okay.
It has to get a yes from the majority, so 50% plus one. But the second part of that process is it has to carry a majority of states. So it means that 4 out of the 7 states have to support the referendum proposal. 3 states voting for it, even with a majority of the population supporting it, won't carry it, so that the proposal will be lost. And the more complicated the question, That's to say that, and coming back to your point about wording, the more complicated and convoluted the wording, the more likely it is that people will tend to vote no. There have only been 8 referendum questions that have been given a yes vote since federation. It's 8. I forget the total number that have been put to the people, but it's only 8 have been successful.
That is a pretty hard ask, then, isn't it? Really, in many respects,
Yes.
given the odds of getting a yes for a referendum vote.
You really need bipartisan support. Both major parties need to be united in the proposal and pushing that proposal. There's also what happens is the yes case and the no case, and when the Parliament votes on the referendum issue, before it can be put to the people, it has to pass both houses of the Parliament. And if there are people who vote against it in the Parliament, then there is a requirement that a no case has to be put to the people. The yes case and the no case has to form part of the referendum. I think it's about 1,000 to 2,000 words written in support or against the proposal. So that's what people talk about when they say the no case being put to the people.
Okay, very interesting. And just in closing, the politics of this situation, do you think that the Prime Minister, who has, to be fair, a history of quite a heavy involvement with Indigenous communities, do you think there is an appetite from the government for this referendum?
I think, yes, that's a tricky question, because I think there's no doubting the Prime Minister, when he says he wants to do something in this regard, he wants to recognise Indigenous people in the Constitution. I think he's very genuine about that. Mm-hmm. He has a fairly consistent political history of at least articulating the views, if you like, in support of Indigenous people. So one might suggest have others within the Parliament, on both sides of the parliamentary divide. But the tricky bit is that many people like to say the feel-good things, but in practice, when we look at what is actually happening, and we don't have the time to sort of delve into this any further really, but what's actually happening on the ground, we have states and jurisdictions in which mandatory detention operates, and it affects Indigenous people far more than it does non-Indigenous people. These sorts of things are still in place. These sorts of legislations and practices, Indigenous people suffer a range of disadvantages that the white population tends to have moved past, and the commentary from leaders of the, shall we say, the white community, the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, are all heart in the right place, but there's a lot of practical stuff that's also in place that seems to contradict the desire to move beyond sort of symbolic. And I think a lot of Indigenous leaders have echoed a thought around that idea that this is all well and good and symbolism's wonderful, but we want something a bit more substantial that actually is meaningful to Indigenous people, not just simply making the white Prime Minister and the white Leader of the Opposition feel good about themselves.
The rubber needs to hit the road, and it is NAIDOC week, so perhaps this is where the idea of the symbolism can be given some real meaning. Dr. Jim Joes, thanks for your time.
My pleasure, Meryl.
Associate Professor Dr. Jim Joes from the University of Newcastle joins us every week to discuss politics.